بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم والحمد لله رب العالمين أحمده وأستعينه وأؤمن به وأتوكل عليه وأستنصره وأستجيره وأستشهده وأستشهد به فإنه من هداه الله فلا مضل له ومن يضلل فلا هادي له ونصلي ونسلم ونبارك على محمد خاتم النبيين الأمين المصطفى وعلى آله وأصحابه ومن اتبعه بإحسان إلى يوم الدين. We start in the name of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, the compassionate, the merciful, the loving, the beloved. And we pray for peace and blessings upon Muhammad, the final prophet, and upon all the prophets of God through history, and upon all those who follow the message of the prophets from time immemorial to the end of times. Subhanallah, Subhanallah, the message of the prophets of Allah, of God, has always been the same in its central themes, in its basic precept, and in the normative, ethical, moral message and trajectory that these prophets have come to humanity time and time again to underscore. It is always summed up in a single phrase: La ilaha illallah. There is no God but God. وَلَا نَعْبُدُ سُوَاهُ. And we worship no one but God and submit to no one but God. The most remarkable thing from a historical outlook, it's rather a reality that stuns you if you read the development of human history, is that time and time again God is underscoring this straightforward and simple message. There is no God but God. There's only one God. And that God is the one worthy of your commitment and your submission. Now, this is always done in a context with two specific prongs and two specific challenges. One, throughout human history, human beings are time and time again drawn to the idea of polytheism or the idea of shirk. So the first prong is a sociological historical process by which, from the prophet Idris alayhi salam, who is a very early prophet, to Noah, to, of course, a fairly local prophet like Saleh, the prophets of the Arabs or the area of Nabat, to Abraham or Ibrahim, to Isaac, to Ishmael, so on and so forth, to Jesus, all the time, all the way up to the Prophet Muhammad alayhi salam. And that is consistently, the idea is there is no God but God, and you can in fact read the history of religion as this constant tug of war between the idea of a single God. You find it in Indian mythology, you find it even in Chinese mythology, you find it in old Sumerian mythologies, Phoenician mythologies. You find it throughout in Greek history and Roman history. You find it in a very pronounced way in Egyptian mythology. A constant pull between a single, one and only God, and a sociological dynamic that always mythologizes the one and only God into a pantheon of gods. Now, of course, if the idea of one and only God was an idea that lended itself easily to the socio-cultural demands of power structures in the ancient world, if the idea of one and only God was consistent with the cultural, psychological orientations of people in the ancient world, it would have had a much easier time anchoring itself in native cultures without always gravitating towards polytheism. Polytheism, the idea of multiple or many gods, whether sometimes even just the God of good and the God of evil, the sort of two gods that split the world and are in a constant battle for, or the God of the sun and the God of darkness, or the God of fire and the God of water, or and so on and so forth. This brings us to the second prong, in which Tawheed, what we call monotheism, but basically this anchoring idea of that there is only one God. Anyone that reads ancient history, and it doesn't really matter whether you read it very deeply or you even just read it superficially, but anyone that reads ancient history is always struck by the constant reoccurrence of the idea, the belief in one and only God, and the constant shift to polytheism and the mythologies of polytheism. So what is that second prong? The second prong relates to why the idea of monotheism was so difficult to be uncorrupted and uncorruptible. Why is it that so many prophets, whether the prophets you read about in the Quran or the prophets you read about in the Bible, if you read the Old Testament is basically a narrative of a line of prophets that come and teach that there's one and only God, and their trials and their tribulations. We even know through archaeology and through historical studies, that even the Israelites were always drawn to polytheism. So among the Israelites, whether before Moses or after Moses, there was literally a virtual carnival of various deities that were adopted. So in other words, their monotheism was constantly corrupted, even among the tribe of Israel, the people that in the most pronounced way represented monotheism in ancient history. So why is that? Well, this brings us to another historical reality that is very significant. And that is the very concept of divinity in ancient history. In the modern mind tends to think of something as either divine or not divine. The modern mind tends to think of either you are a temporal, secular, if you will, human being, you're a human being of blood and flesh and so on, and you're either just a normal person, or you're a normal animal, or you're a normal element, like water, light, fire, or you're divine, and if you're divine, then there's nothing temporal about you. You're God. You're up there. That's not the way the ancient mind worked. The ancient mind saw divinity and the very idea of sanctification of divinity as something of a gradation. As something of a gradation. So a human being can start out a human being and become divine. Something could start out divine and become human. Animals could have a physical body, but be divine in some sense or another. Elements could, even like water or fire, could be observed, experienced, consumed, but somehow reflect divinity. There was a very serious and practical political reason for that. And this is especially that the bearers of political power, those who monopolized wealth and power, always wanted to lay claim to divinity. So think of ancient Hindu religion or old Buddhist religion, or the very concept of the king or queens of old, They might be born human, but rare was the king or ruler that would resist the temptation of being deified. Put it again to emphasize the idea. Why was polytheism so attractive to the ancient mind? Well, one, of course, without the rational causistic method of thinking, mythology, with the way that you represented and symbolized meaning in the world. But beyond mythology, there was a very pragmatic, practical reason. And that is the high class, the clergy, the rulers, the kings, the queens, always wanted the ability to lay claim to divinity. If the king is divine, disobeying the king, challenging the king, becomes a crime that is practically unforgivable. So, for instance, in Roman law and in medieval common law, there was no separation between a crime against the state and a crime against majesty. The crime of les majestas in Latin, meaning if you commit crime against the emperor, you've committed a crime against the state, but also a crime against God, because the emperor is divine. Think about how amazingly attractive that idea to the ancient power structures were. If divinity is separated strictly from temporality or humanity, the divine occupies its space and the human occupies its space, then kings and queens and priests and rabbis and all types of holy men could not claim divinity for themselves. And if they could not claim divinity for themselves, then what do? They relinquish privilege. The claim of divinity was very important in order to grab onto privilege. Even look at our world today, and you will see how strong, how much of a stronghold that idea has on the human mind. Look at some dictatorial countries like Saudi Arabia or like Egypt. Literally, the way the ruler is talked about in Saudi Arabia or in the Emirates or in Egypt, it's as if they can do no error. They can make no mistake. They are praised constantly and consistently. If they weren't Muslim, they would have deified the ruler. Right now, it's a deification for all practical purposes. Whatever the ruler does, it's wonderful. The ruler can speak no error, can make no mistake. If they existed in the ancient world, these rulers most certainly would have become gods. Remember that many Roman emperors either would insist on becoming gods in their lifetime, like Caesar, or sometimes would be deified after their death, because a weak ruler wants to rule while drawing the legitimacy from a former ruler who has now become God. So consistently, God sends the same message. There is no God but God. But consistently, this message clashes and rubs against a sociological reality of mythology, particularly mythology that serves the power structures of the day. Rulers want to be deified. Noblemen want to be deified or semi-deified. Human beings want to claim a divine-like right to be obeyed. And in order to do that, there's always an alliance between the clergy, the religious class, and the ruling class, as the religious class spawns off mythology. Reading in the mythologies of the ancient world is endlessly fascinating. And the mythology always serves the ruling elite because it allows for deification. This is why when Allah tells us in the shirk لَظُلْمٌ عَظِيمٌ that associating partners is a great injustice, God is not talking about God's own right only. But there is a practical sociological consequences to the aggregation or the compromising of the idea of monotheism. Is that human beings deify other human beings or even deify institutions. So we know that for a good part of European history, the church as an institution was deified. It could make no error, and it in fact could grant absolutions on God's stead. And as we all know, that gave the church an enormous amount of power, and that power was leveraged for all types of causes and all types of purposes. Among them is that it made the church very rich. It is critical that we understand the message of Islam with that historical backdrop. Monotheism, in even its most primitive form and in its most developed forms, has always posed a challenge to rulers. But you want to see the tenacious hold of polytheistic mythologies. Even after Islam, mythologies of deification still struggled to exist, even after Islam. So you get mythologies of deifications in things like the Durzi religion, and the Nusayri religion, and the Ismaili religion, in some Sufi ideas, in some Shia ideas. the idea that the barrier between what is human and what is divine is not that solid. Is not that solid. But because Islam had a very strong monotheistic narrative, and because the Quran, unlike the Old Testament and the New Testament, was historically preserved, the pull of polytheism was often camouflaged either in very sophisticated philosophies like in Ismaili theology or in the esoteric groups like Zaydi theology or so on, Yazidi theology or Nusayri theologies, or camouflaged by teaching a doctrine of strict obedience to the ruler regardless of monotheism. So what does monotheism teach you? The first teaching about monotheism is what? If you submit to God, you submit to no one else. Your liberation as a human being is through God, because if I submit to God, I submit to no one lesser than God. It's a very revolutionary idea. And throughout history, it was a revolutionary idea. And if you submit to no one but God, then no one can claim superiority over you, the type of superiority that makes them entitled to obedience simply by their status. Everyone has to appeal to either your reason or your heart, but not mythology. Not it is, because it's a secret, it's a mystery. Of course, we know that so many dictatorial rulers, what they did is to try to still creep, still to sneak in a polytheistic ethic into a monotheistic moral universe. The polytheistic ethic is strict obedience to the ruler, whether they do right or wrong. You want to see a perfect example of that? Listen to the modern day theologians in Jami Islam or Madkhali Islam and so on, who don't tell you the ruler is divine, but they tell you the ruler is divinely chosen. But it is the same precise dynamic, except for the ultimate conclusion of the polytheistic methodological process to appeal to elements that cannot be accounted for through human reason or action. If God chose the ruler, that is an appeal to a mythology that is ultimately unprovable. You can't contest it. You can't rationally challenge it, because neither you nor him know what God's will is. Every prophet that Allah has ever sent has always coupled the message of monotheism with a struggle against injustice. Every single prophet. No prophet came and said, I am teaching monotheism, but I teach you also to submit yourself to injustice. That was the core message of every prophet. Now when we come to the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ, there is a most remarkable thing. By then, humanity had matured to a level. It has gone through the Greek experience, it had gone through the Roman experience, it has gone through the Egyptian experience, it has gone through the Phoenician mythologies, it has gone through the Hindu and Buddhist mythologies, and now with a living, preserved text, the text of the Quran, humanity had reached a level in literacy, the spread of literacy, which if you compare to the time of Jesus or time of Moses, is non-existent. But at the time of the Prophet Muhammad, humanity and humanity's relationship to writing and language had reached a point where monotheism would have a fighting chance. And mythology could possibly be defeated. This critical historical understanding speaks volumes to us. Throughout the Old Testament, time and time again, the prophets of the Old Testament say there is one God and only one God. And I could quote 100 different quotes, if not more, from how often the idea of Tawheed, of only one God, who is the creator, who is the omnipotent, who is the immutable, who is the eternal, is emphasized in the Old Testament. There's no mention of Trinity, there is no mention of duality, there is no mention of a God and a Son of God or anything like that throughout the Old Testament. Even then, if you read the history of the Israelites, even with the text of the Old Testament being it is, for most of the history of the Israelites, and this is just a historical academic scholarly fact, most of the history of ancient Israel, a pantheon of gods were worshipped. Polytheism was firmly perpetuated again and again and again and again among the Israelites despite the Old Testament. The mythology of the three-headed Godhead was well known in Hindu religion, was well known in Egyptian religion, and most importantly, was well anchored in Greek philosophy. Just read Plato. Plato tells us that God consists of three: the Godhead, the equivalent of the Father, the Word, and the Spirit. Christianity starts out with the message of Isa, there is only one God, there is one God and only one God. And as long as Christianity is an Israelite religion, that narrative persists in the Christian texts. And again, I wish I had the time to go through and show you in the Bible how it tells the story. Ultimately, when Paul, and it wasn't just Paul, but Paul was the genesis of it, so-called Pauline Christianity, decided to take the Christian message from the Israelite people, i.e. from Jews, to non-Jewish populations in Greece especially. There started again the adoption of the mythology, the polytheistic mythology of the three-headed God. From Greek philosophy, with a little smudge of Egyptian mythology, and also the Sumerians had a three-headed God, and so on and so forth, and the Hindus. All of this is modern scholarship. All of this is published. You can easily just read this material. I could give you a long list of references. Now, separate between monotheism, the theology of monotheism, and especially Greek version of polytheism adopted by Christianity. Monotheism said that the world could have 3 gods, 4 gods, 5 gods, 100 gods, whatever, but each god does a specific job. When God is on earth as a human, God is on earth fully as a human, performing as a human being, doing nothing like God. But when God ascends to the heavens, God acts fully as a God in the heavens and has nothing of his human attributes that he had on earth. Monotheism recognized multiple gods with multiple functions, either all done at the same time or done at different times. The Trinity was not an adoption of monotheist mythology, because the Trinity was 3 gods who are eternally there, immutably there, equal gods. None of them come from anywhere. They're all present at the same time as equals, immutable, with none of them having a specific job to do. So, I mean, and that's why they call it a mystery. Because if you're going to have 3 gods, all precisely overlapping in powers, and 3 gods precisely overlapping in ability, and precisely overlapping in everything as equal gods, how could they be one? And that's why you can read as much as you want in Christian theology. The ultimate conclusion every time is, well, Trinity is a mystery. No one has ever been able to understand it, and no one will ever understand it, because it's a mystery that is fundamentally incoherent. 3 and 1. The most common example when you talk to Christians is they tell you, oh, well, you know, it's like H2O. You know, it's H2O is water, it's ice, and it's gas. When it's water, it flows. When it's ice, it's hard. And then when it's glass, it's... That's not an example of the Trinity. That's monotheism. A God that can become water, and when it's water, it's not ice, and it's not gas. And when it's gas, it's not ice or water. And when it's ice, it's not gas or water. That's monotheism. That's not the Trinity. So it's a very bad example. Some have said, well, you know, it's like, you know, 3 fingers in one hand, there's no unity, no identity, if they're all equal in power. Anyway, it was the persistence of a mythology of polytheism, and this shows you that even the modern mind is still attracted to some primitive mythologies. Even the modern mind wants to feel cushiony and warm, and with little love hearts. A God that dies for our sins and suffers, and oh my God, God died for us. We must be worth so much because God died for us. Typical ancient mythology stuff. Very, very inconsistent with the idea of individual accountability, individual responsibility, and rationality. So let me tell you, Muslims, something that we have to understand and learn. Islam was a critical step in the history of humanity for the birth of the Reformation and the Enlightenment. Without Islam and the deconstruction of mythologies and the reclamation of the rational God, what in philosophy the causal God, and the reclamation of the idea that when you obey another human being, you are not obeying a God. And when you deal with another human being, you do not deal with a God. Without that, Europe would have never experienced the Reformation or the Enlightenment. And this is precisely why it kills me when I see modern Muslims make Islam stupid, like the ancient world. Bring back Islam to a universe of mythology, a universe of the irrational and the fantastical and the irresponsible, and talk about how we must obey this and obey that and not disobey because this is God's will. That's pre-Islamic mythology. What in Islam we call Jahiliyyah. That's the Jahiliyyah. That's not Islam. You are undermining the Islamic contribution to the progress of the human race. Because the human race had to put Christian mythology aside to progress to rationalism. It wouldn't have been possible otherwise. أقول قولي هذا وأستغفر الله لي ولكم أسأل الله يستجب لكم. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم والحمد لله رب العالمين والصلاة والسلام على محمد وعلى آله وأصحابه وتبعهم بإحسان إلى يوم الدين. Recently, well, every week, there are developments around us that scream into our face what Islamophobia is doing to us as Muslims. Concentration camps in the millions in China. the increasingly horrible oppression of Muslims in Kashmir. India passing a law that allows political asylum and eventual citizenship for every religion except Islam. The continuing horrors of the Rohingyas. But add to all of this something more local and personal to us. Trump signing an executive order in which the American government intervenes in an area that no government has a business in intervening in. There's something called Title VI. Title VI prohibits educational institutions from discriminating on the base of religion, on the base of race, ethnicity, national origin, but Title VI doesn't say anything about religion. So Title VI allows universities to discriminate on the basis of religion. For a long time, every time universities try to invest money into studying the Israeli conflict, Israeli-Palestinian, Israeli occupation and subjugation of the Palestinian people, Islamophobic organizations and pro-Zionist organizations, if that university is not maligning Islam, if that university is putting any amount of focus on the Palestinian plight, if that university is supporting the BDS, Boycott Israel movement, divestment from Israel, the Zionist organizations complain that this is anti-Semitism and try to get that university to lose federal funding as a result. In other words, these same organizations that tell us that Muslims don't understand freedom of speech because of the Salman Rushdie event, these same organizations come and they censor speech by qualified, thoroughly vetted academics because they're doing their research on Palestinian refugee camps, or because they're doing their research on the amount of Palestinians in Israeli prisons, or the amount of Palestinians that are murdered by the Israeli army every single week, if not day. They come and say, oh, that's anti-Semitic. Not all, and I'm not saying all Jewish organizations. I'm talking about the Zionist organizations and Islamophobic organizations who lobby. So what does Trump do? Trump signs an executive order that says, for the purpose of Title VI, Jews are not a religion, they're a nationality. That blows your mind. The federal government intervenes to define what is a nationality and what is a religion? How can that be constitutional? But why does he do that? Well, he does that because the Islamophobes were lobbying him to pass that executive order so that now any university that doesn't study Islam, quote unquote, in the right way, in the Islamophobic way, or that criticizes Israel for its abysmal human rights record, or that criticizes Israel colonization of Palestinian land, they can lose Title VI money. A form of clear, outright censorship. There, the Islamophobes have no problem with censorship. They only have it when it is practiced by Muslims. What kills me you would think that with all the Muslims suffering in Kashmir and millions, I am talking about millions, you would have Muslims, the fire lit up in their heart, and they would start putting their money where their mouth is, so we can all fight this incredibly overwhelming threat to our academic freedom and to the future of Islam and the future of your kids in American universities. But what even kills me more, where are those people in Zaytuna that defended Trump? Where is their voice? Where is that fellow professor at Zaytuna that said, Trump didn't ban Muslims? Where is Hamza Yusuf and his serving on the Human Rights Commission? Where is their voice? Why are they so spineless? Why do they bring Islam back to the mythology of the deity king? Because Trump is appointed by God, so Trump is like a king. We don't disobey him, we don't challenge him. Why are they bringing Islam back to shirk? The gift of Islam and the gift of Muhammad ﷺ was liberation from mythology, from irrationality, and from subjugation. That's what light the fire under the Islamic civilization. The freedom of the human spirit. Why are these modern Muslims killing our religion and bringing back the theology of the stupids who believe in myth, the myth of the ancients, who don't believe in personal responsibility or personal accountability? I'm going to close with one. Someone wrote me and asked me, what do you think is the single most factor for the spread of Christianity after colonialism? Not through, but except for political oppression. In other words, take out the power dynamic that I talked about in my last khutbah, and said, what do you think is the biggest thing that has made Christianity spread in various parts of the world, especially in places like Japan, Korea, the Philippines, Africa? And I thought about it very hard. And do you know what I think? It's the white Jesus. White Jesus. Jesus is represented in every image since Paul as a cute, good-looking white man. Yesterday we had an event in my son's school, and they had a nativity scene, and I stood there before the white Jesus for a very long time staring at him. You look nothing like your description in the Bible. Nothing. What if Jesus looked like the Palestinian man from Galilee that he was? What if our image of Jesus was the Arab, the Jew from Palestine, from Galilee? All these women whose hearts melt about Jesus, and all these men whose Jesus, it's the white Jesus. The image of the white Jesus conquered because racism conquered. And until you learn to be proud of your race, you can't begin to understand why Jesus is never represented in the way he's described in the Bible. And inshallah, in one of my future khutbahs, I'll talk about Jesus and the way his looks in the Bible. And you can compare him with all the known images of Jesus, except for the church in Ethiopia. But even the Coptic church, he looks like a European, like a hot, young male. That surprised my the student who was asking me. But think about it. اللهم اعف عنا واغفر لنا وارحمنا يا رب العالمين واهدنا لأقرب هذا رشدا. Allah forgive our sins, help guide us to the light, give us light in our hearts, allow us to understand and agree in your beauty and grow in your love. Ya Rabb al-Alameen.